really important for them to just keep an open mind and say, hey, let's invite local players, let's invite individuals who are in these particular instances to help us find more contextually relevant solutions.
Welcome to the Global Digital Futures Think Tank. This session is on IT for development, how technology is being used in the development sector in the Global South. And on the panel today, in the discussion today, we have Trueman Mabumbo, who is the creator of Dzidzo paDen, which is a WhatsApp chatbot launched here in Harare, Zimbabwe. Trueman is an A-level student at St. George's here in Harare, Zimbabwe. And we also have Tanvi Kanchan from IT4Change. Tanvi is the communications assistant for IT4Change in India. And we have Eliza Bacon, the junior producer at Global Digital Futures, as well as an MA student in global media and post-national communications at SOAS. So yeah, we're talking about IT for change, how tech is being used in sustainable development. I feel like this conversation will probably have more of an education stance, which is really interesting. So I just want to start with you, Trueman. Like, could you tell us what inspired, just tell us a bit about Dzidzo paDen and what inspired this project? What opportunities did you see and what gaps were you trying to fill?
Thank you so much, Chipo. And I think before I begin, I just want to say thank you so much for this opportunity and to be in the panel with all these amazing people. And I think what I would begin with in regards to your question on the gaps that I identified in the space in Zimbabwe in general. I think it was last year around May when I had started learning online, because I learned at a private school here in Zimbabwe called St. George's College. So when there were lockdowns and all of that, we naturally just shifted to, online learning. But within that space, I then discovered that, a lot of kids around Zimbabwe, across Zimbabwe, aren't learning. And I found that to be a significant gap, because even access to those soft copy resources of, ZimSec is a local examinations board here. It's very difficult to find those resources. So that was kind of like the gap that I identified. And then I was just thinking to myself, hey, what can I actually do in order to just, make sure that people understand that there's this gap, and what exactly can we do to make sure that those resources are accessible? That's when I stumbled in an article by a local publication here called TechZim that said that about 5.5 million Zimbabweans are on WhatsApp. And I just figured, hey, what if we just use that platform that's more easily accessible to many in order to distribute those resources? And that's when I thought of making Dzidzo paDen. So in essence, Dzidzo paDen is an automated WhatsApp-based chatbot that is distributing academic resources to students right across Zimbabwe. Currently, we are distributing for all the exam classes, that's notes, past papers, and mark schemes, but with a greater vision in mind to just do more in the space of inclusivity in education, because it really needs to be bridged, that gap between those who can afford to learn online and those who cannot. But yeah, in a nutshell, that's the inspiration behind it, the gap that I identified, and how I then thought of the idea.
Great, amazing. And it's quite interesting, like, yeah, when you're just talking about the gap that you were trying to fill and the context that was existing at that time around you. And I want to actually go to Tanvi and ask you, like, IT for Change, you also have a number of education programs. And what are some of the gaps that you see in the context, and what sort of projects are being created to, address that?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Chipo, for the question and for having me on this panel today. And I really just want to kind of firstly echo a lot of the insights that Trueman brought to the table about the fact that there is this gap in being able to access inclusive education. There are a lot of gaps that haven't either been accounted for or haven't been factored in with this quite massive, almost global shift to online education that's happened over the course of the pandemic, starting from last year. And Trueman brings some great insights, I think, to the table about how you as a student kind of identified those gaps from being as a student in that system itself, and being like, okay, these are the ways that myself and my peers are not able to maybe make the most use of it, and address it from like the student's perspective, which I think is such a great initiative. And at IT for Change, I think a lot of our work in education, we do a lot of work specifically in the local context of Karnataka, which is a state, a southern state in India, and is where actually our nonprofit is also based out of. It's based out of Bangalore. So we do a lot of work there, and a lot of our work is actually focused towards the teachers and teacher educators, and also teachers in training. So those who might be doing like undergraduate courses to then become qualified teachers. And a lot of our work really focuses on digital capacity building for teachers. Because it's one thing for students to be able to, of course, equitably access online education, but at the same time, a lot of the work that we do is with government and public schools in Karnataka. And of course, there's a very big gap when we look at the digital capacity or the digital literacy of teachers themselves. And ultimately, the way in which we conceptualize technology for education and technology for development is basically to see how can we help teachers better their learning outcomes through the use of digital technologies and ICTs. So a lot of our work is about programs and workshops for building these kind of capacities for teachers, doing things like running workshops on how to use FOSS platforms, so free and open source software platforms. That's a very large part of our work. Again, maybe I can talk a little bit more about the problems with proprietary software and how that becomes a barrier to learning and access in and of itself, and hence the focus on FOSS. But there are some great FOSS platforms out there. For example, GeoGebra, which is a FOSS platform to help in teaching mathematics and graphing. And ultimately there is a lot of stuff out there, but it's about enabling teachers to actually bring that into their classrooms or bring that into their learning and teaching methodologies so as to increase the learning outcomes of the students. So I think here, that's one gap that we've identified as well. How do you equip the teachers to be able to teach better or kind of create that collaborative learning environment? But I think another thing that we also do a lot of work on is there's the language problem when we come to areas of the global south, and when you look at things like open educational resources or OERs, most of them are in English. The majority of them are in English, and I think that with our work, it's also a lot about thinking, well, this is a barrier to access, because if we don't have this in a local language, we don't have this in for example, the work that we do, it's a lot in Kannada, which is one of the major languages spoken in the state of Karnataka. How can we translate these resources into Kannada? How can we have more resources in local languages for teachers? Because that's so important. It's so English centric out there, and that's another gap. That's another gap when we think about open educational resources. So that's also a lot of work that we do as well. And yeah, it's really great to also hear from students currently learning in the time of the pandemic, because it's such an unprecedented time. Of course, we at IT for Change, we've been around for 21 years now, and a majority, if not all of those years, we've also been doing education work, but it's been such a change just in the last 12 months itself. It's really, the paradigm has shifted completely. So it's really great to hear from someone like Trueman as well, who's, in another part of the world, and how really that shift to digital online education has impacted just everything, I think. Yeah.
Really interesting. Thank you, Tanvi. And you brought up two things that I want to also pose to Trueman. The considerations around, let's say, language and maybe other barriers to entry or barriers to access for the solutions that might be developed. And you also mentioned that there are a lot of things in the market, perhaps in India. So I'm wondering, Trueman, in Zim, was your idea one of many that are in the market? Are there different options in the market? And even in the process of creating your project, like what considerations did you have to make it like more accessible and actually something that people could use?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. And I think to begin with, I would say in regards to chatbot technology distributing resources, I think we are the second to do it in Zimbabwe. And the first one was Hotbox. And my developer actually is from Hotbox. But they weren't doing it as the major thing, and they weren't really doing it in the sense of saying we want to provide an inclusive approach to our education model in Zimbabwe. It was more of a feature in their company, because what they do is they do more of ads. But on a wider scale, there are multiple organizations that are trying to fill that gap of a lack of access to resources. There's Dzidzo, and the Ministry of Primary and Secondary Education here also just reintroduced what's called the My Passport, and it's an online platform basically for courses, resources, and all of that. But the major or the most significant challenge that I realized when I was still looking for solutions around this problem is a lot of children do not have access to the internet to begin with. So I think for statistics right across Africa, because I was now doing a bit of research right across Africa, they say about 87% of the kids do not have access to the internet. This is according to a UNICEF report that was released last year in October, which means about 474 million kids right across Africa do not have access to the internet. So if we have a solution in the education space that is saying, oh, we want to cover that gap, but we have a resource that's only found on the internet, I feel like it's kind of like it's a half-baked solution, if I can say. So that's when I just realized, hey, it's better to just use WhatsApp, which is more popular, or yeah, it's cheaper, more affordable to a lot more people. So yeah, there are other people who are doing it, but the major threats or the major challenges, they are doing it online, but the resources are there. So it's just a matter of finding an easier and more accessible platform. And to that regard, we are the only ones who are doing it for free and just for the sake of providing the resources to kids who do not have access.
And just as a second part of that, did you have to make any considerations for language, or just for the actual user experience, like the messaging that you send to the students, just to make it easy and accessible, like user experience within the chatbot?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's actually a very significant problem, especially in regards to in Zimbabwe. Education is really a problem. So you realize there actually are some school children who do not understand English, who do not understand any other language except maybe Shona or Ndebele or whatever language that they speak. I mean, there are 16 languages in Zimbabwe. But I think for a start, we just decided, let's just use English as the basis of our program. Like if someone wants resources, they are going to interact more with English. But in regards to the resources that we have there, we have resources for almost all the languages. So we have Shona, we have Ndebele, we have English there. But the vision is to be able to make the chatbots more user-friendly to a lot more kids. So it's within our plans to make sure that we have, say a chatbot that will have Shona as its primary language, such as Ndebele as its primary language, because we really do understand that it's really a significant challenge that really needs to be solved. But we just decided that for a start, it's just better to just use English, which is more of a common language within a lot of the students. But yeah, that's a really big challenge.
So Tanvi, I just want to ask you, like from an organizational perspective, maybe you might have sort of a broad vision of how sort of technology for development initiatives, what are sort of like the challenges in actually getting them up and running, or launching them effectively? And also maintaining and making sure that they continue to be effective after they've launched?
Absolutely. No, I think when we talk about tech solutions or kind of technological approaches to education, for example, that being the topic today, I think there are a lot of challenges, and there is, one of the things that kind of is quite pervasive is this kind of techno-solutionist approach to how technologies are used in education. And there's kind of this approach, this discourse that, well, if we just move everything online, or we just do it with this way, with this one technology, that is the solution that will take care of everything. And that's just not really the case. I mean, that's not the reality. That's not the truth at all. And I think, there's a need to kind of understand what is the meaningful application of technologies in the sector of education to actually better learning outcomes, rather than just looking at it as, oh, we're just going to move everything online. And a lot of things of what Trueman was saying that are true in Zimbabwe are also true in India. When you look at things like just access to the internet, that's not a reality for everyone. Forget about access to the internet. A lot of times access to electricity is not a given. And you have, periods of downtime when it comes to electrification in different parts of the country. So when you have those kind of the basic building blocks that are not equitably accessible, the fact of joining an online classroom where you might have video and audio being transmitted, that's 3 steps away, that's 4 steps away. And it really is something where you need to think about, well, what are the barriers to access that are really there? And I think that's where the whole move to this 100% digital education during the pandemic has really tripped up, because there's been this idea that, well, we're just going to move everything online, but the people who are affected are the most marginalized constituencies. So, especially in the last year itself, we've seen that education, of course, is not just about the delivery of, classroom learning and teaching, but it's also things like just having that space to interact with your peers outside of classrooms, right? Which is, you can do that in a school environment. For a lot of students in India, it's also the place where they get their midday meal. So maybe that's one of the most important meals that they're getting in the day, and one of their most important sources of nutrition. For a lot of students and their parents as well, it's a form of childcare, right? When you don't have anyone at home, where the parent or parents are not able to look after the child, that they're in a relatively safer environment for 6 to 8 hours of the day. So this entire idea that we can just move online and everything will be fine, I don't think it's not the truth. I don't think it's really, ultimately what happens is you're just leaving out the most marginalized. And I think as far as the challenges that have been there, the challenges were very different pre-COVID, and the challenges are quite different post-COVID. I think the challenges with some of our work pre-COVID has been just kind of maybe getting over the skepticism that maybe some teachers have about technological platforms or just technological solutions. There is some amount of skepticism that might be there, very rightfully so, for certain teachers in government or public schools, especially a lot of our work that might be with certain groups of students, such as adolescent girls. We work a lot with adolescent girls as well. When we think about gender in access to the internet, of course, things get more complicated, and it's also true for education. So you're thinking about the fact that, girls in a family, adolescent girls in a family may not be allowed to access the internet at all. Maybe, there are also a lot of families that will share one device between themselves, and maybe the girls of the family are not allowed to spend as much time on that device. So this complicates a bunch of things, including, of course, education. But there is, I think, this kind of protective patriarchal nature of, well, we need to protect girls from the dangers of the internet. And that complicates things when you think about the educational resources that are available online. So a lot of our work has also kind of been to address the protective nature, the skepticism that teachers may have about allowing girls to be online, but also at the same time, kind of equipping adolescent girls and doing workshops with them to understand these are the dangers and the harms of the online world, but these are the ways in which you can, these are the forms of redressal, these are the forms of remedy, this is the way in which you can engage with the internet in a safer way for yourself and for your peers, and really empower them with the capability of say, producing their own digital stories, producing their own audio clips, doing that kind of training in platforms like Audacity, again, a FOSS platform. And it's ultimately about reframing the perspective of we are consumers of the internet to we are active participants in the internet, and we are actively and collaboratively kind of building these educational resources or these other resources together. So that was, I think, a challenge pre-COVID, but a challenge post or during COVID, I might say, has been really, I think, coming back to some of the points that I mentioned about this whole idea of, well, we can just go online and everything will be fine, because ultimately it's not really addressing the needs of those in public or government schools. And there's also that kind of gap in digital literacy that's growing, because children are dropping out. There's been a very large dropout rate over the last year, because they're just like, well, I can't access the teaching that's happening online, so I'm just going to drop out. Child marriages have increased, child labor has increased. So we see a lot of these other things that are also spiking up. But yeah, I think these are some of the challenges that have cropped up. And of course, it's quite different in a COVID world. But I think these are things as well that we're just trying to constantly address. How do you equip teachers and students and learners in general with the agency of saying that the internet is also my space? How can I be better equipped to use it to kind of fulfill my own needs and desires and wants? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tanvi. Like, you brought up a lot of points there from the digital literacy piece in our podcast, which is like sort of linked to this conversation on IT for Development with Viamo. She was talking about digital literacy. She was also talking about the misconception of, sorry, this is Hannah Metcalf, the country director who we're speaking to. She was talking about, this misconception that because there's high mobile penetration, that means it's high internet penetration. It doesn't mean the same thing. I really found it interesting that you drill down onto that household use of mobile technologies and how that can be gendered. That's really, but then also looking at there is this online aspect of these solutions, but also the offline, like what actually going to school physically means to children. So that's like really, really important. And I was wondering, I'll pose this question to Trueman. What have you sort of learned about your user base, like in the process of launching the project? Like maybe you could tell us how many students are using the app, if there's anything that's been discovered about, just user behaviors because of the app as well.
Definitely, yeah. Thank you for that question, Chipo. I think the first thing would be when I thought about this idea and when we were working on it, I was really just thinking to myself that, hey, Rozio is about 15,000 users. So if we reach maybe 10,000 users, then that'll be like the success point for us. But surprisingly, when we first launched, we had about 5,000 users. And since then, we have amassed more than 80,000 users. So I think the first thing that we realized was the fact that the fact that we're using a more popular platform just went to prove the conception that people actually want to learn, but they don't have the platforms that they can easily use. So Dzidzo paDen, I would say, came at the right time when people were in that space where they were trying to look for resources but could not find, places where they could use where they could find them. And I always say that Dzidzo paDen was born out of the idea of saying, hey, we want to provide an inclusive approach to the education model. And to a lot of people, that means that, okay, we are targeting rural students who do not have, internet access, who do not have this, who do not have that. But surprisingly, what I then realized throughout this period is that even those kids who have internet access, I think in Zimbabwe, we have two main examinations that we use. So it's either someone writes Cambridge or ZimSec. So for those who write local exams, even if they have the internet, even if they have phones, laptops, and all of that, access to resources is still significantly a big challenge for them, because for the longest time, it's either you have hard copy resources or you don't have them at all. So what we then realized throughout this process is that this chatbot is actually helping students right across the board. So it's helping those who do not have access to the internet, but still have access to WhatsApp. And this does not necessarily mean that the kids must have phones, because I think when we launched, when I gave my speech, I actually told parents that, you know what, we understand that a lot of kids do not have phones. So it's very important that you use your phones as well to just give them those resources, download them, then give them, download them. So that's another thing that we also encouraged. And I think from the feedback that I've been getting from our Facebook page and just generally on WhatsApp, when I talk to some people, I talk to a lot of parents who are saying, we're actually using it, and we are giving our kids these resources. So I think the three key things that we got were that, number one, it's not only those who are in rural areas that actually need these resources. From the user base that we have, a significant part of it is actually people who are in more established schools, who are in urban areas, who did not have access to these soft copy resources. Number two is that we realized that the kids do not actually need to have phones themselves. And because of the cooperation with parents, we've actually been able to get more people involved. Because I said we have about 80,000 users, but you realize that some of the users are people who are in a family of, say, 5 or 6, who are using one phone to say, oh, you need resources for grade 7s. I'm going to download them. Then here you go. I'm going to download for Form 4s. Here you go. So I think on a wider scale, it's really been a success in that a lot of people have found that platform that's easily accessible. And in regards to general data, we collect data as to geography, the level that someone is in. So for example, primary or secondary or advanced level. But we don't collect a lot of the data, because what we wanted was, if someone wants to use the chatbot for the first time, it doesn't take them more than 5 minutes, for example, to start accessing those resources. So the registration page is a bit smaller. But from that data, we're actually able to see that, okay, we have a significant majority who are in these places, a significant majority are in this level. We're still yet to analyze that, but from just generally the interactions that I've had with people who've been using this, that those are some of the insights that I've got.
That's really great, Trueman. And as you were speaking, I have 2 questions actually, which I think we sort of jumped. Firstly, what are the resources that the students are accessing on the platform? Like, what do they actually download?
Great. So like I said, we are currently distributing resources for exam classes. So that's grade 7s, Form 4s, and upper 6s. So on the platform, they get for all the subjects for example, for grade 7s, we have all the subject areas: maths, Shona, English, Ndebele, environmental science, agriculture. So in those specific subject areas, we have notes, topical notes that are in accordance to the syllabi by the ministry, because we also worked with the ministry. And we also have past papers from ZIMSEC. So like I said, for the longest time, it was either you have hard copy resources or you do not have them at all. So we actually had to knock on ZIMSEC doors and say, hey, we want those papers and we want to put them on our platform. And we had to buy them, but it was not really significant. It was more of a symbolic gesture to say, oh, we're going to buy them for 0.001 cent per paper. But it was more to just make them more accessible on a soft copy. So students will also have access to past papers and also the mark schemes to those past papers. But beyond that, we are currently working on notes and worksheets and mark schemes also for the other grades and forms with the Ministry of Education. But for now, it's just notes, past papers, mark schemes for the subject areas.
Interesting. And yeah, the other thing that sort of came to my mind when you were speaking before was that you were getting, you get feedback from Facebook, which I think is really interesting. I think it's a quite interesting way of doing your user research and user testing, in a sense, or getting user feedback. Is that like the principal way that you get insights from users? Are there other ways that you're sort of getting feedback and user insights?
For now, it's just been Facebook, and also my WhatsApp, my personal WhatsApp, because some of the people I know them personally, and some of the people actually go out of their way to actually find me and say, hey, thank you for this and that, and we've managed to get these resources. But the main reason why we use Facebook is because, in a way, Facebook and WhatsApp are on the same cost level, in a way, because we have like separate data bundles. Yeah, that's what they're called, data bundles. Yeah, so it's either you buy internet or you buy separate bundles for Facebook or for WhatsApp, which for WhatsApp and Facebook, it's the costs are almost similar, if not the same. So a lot of people actually on Facebook, but that's more of the parents, not the kids. So that's why I've been saying that some of the parents are the ones that I actually interact with on Facebook and all of that. But beyond that, yeah, we're also trying to actually go into schools and say, hey, we have this platform, please use it, and also give us feedback. But because of COVID, of course, and the lockdowns, we haven't been able to do that. So we've just been using that Facebook and also my personal platforms to just interact with people and kind of get that feedback to say, hey, how are you finding the systems? Because sometimes people go on the system and then they are trying to get resources, because we don't have, some of the resources are limited. We don't have all of them. So some other people actually come and then they say, oh, we are trying to look for physics resources. We can't get these papers and these papers. And that's when I actually explained to them that, oh, we don't have those resources yet. So those have been the main lines of communication that we've been using.
Yeah, I find that like really interesting. It's fantastic. It's kind of just organic, responsive, iterative, like just responding to the needs of the context. It's very interesting. So Tanvi, I wanted to go back to you and just on that aspect of like researching and user research, user insights to, I guess, come up with the most relevant initiatives. What are sort of the processes that you've seen in some of the programs that IT for Change does, for example?
Sure, yeah. So before I actually get into that, I just wanted to maybe respond to a couple of things that Trueman said as well, which I thought were just so important because, I think one of the things that struck me when I was looking into the chatbot that you developed a little bit more, I was like, wow, it's very smart to use it on WhatsApp because A, of course, it's a platform that most people use, but also B, because of the data bundling kind of issue that you brought up as well, where I said, I was thinking about it and I was like, yeah, you buy access to the internet separately, and very often telecom providers will give you like a separate bundle for access to WhatsApp or Facebook that may not be data limited. And that completely changes when the entire kind of landscape of having to pay for access to the internet and therefore having to pay for access to digital education, because you have it on a platform that might already be covered by a data bundle. You're already kind of negating that whole aspect. And yeah, so I just kind of wanted to just remark on that because I thought that was such a great way of using the tools that people are already using to make information available, and also doing it in a smart way and understanding the barriers that prepaid data is probably an issue, and then how do we kind of go around that. And I mean, on the same lines, I think also one of the things that we really advocate for is, of course, like I said, there's been this very drastic shift of digital online education over the last year, but it's more of a systemic ongoing problem or a systemic ongoing issue. And it's something that needs a lot of collaboration from a lot of different sectors, especially I think the government and public sectors, and a lot of investment into education. It's not something that can happen overnight, especially when you don't already have a digital education infrastructure that's been set up that works. And along the same lines of these kinds of access to certain platforms being covered in terms of cost, one of the things that can really help make digital education more accessible is if ISPs and government bodies were to kind of tie up and say, well, we're going to allow students and teachers free access to this particular FOSS video conferencing platform for doing their classes or having the online classroom. And one of the platforms that we use is Big Blue Button, which is a FOSS video conferencing platform. So even just having things like ISP saying, okay, the government is going to pay us, but it's going to be free for the students and the teachers to access Big Blue Button through their data service provider. That means that you don't actually then have to pay for things like video bandwidth and audio bandwidth, which then makes it very prohibitive for students to access online education. So sorry, it's just a few things that kind of were coming up as I was listening to Trueman speak and thinking about how important that was.
No, that, sorry to jump in and then you can carry on. That point about, well, telcos and maybe governments and institutions working together is super important. We were having another session, our last session on NFTs, we had a senior lecturer from Wits Art School in Johannesburg, and she did say one of the best responses during the pandemic was that Wits University teamed with the local telcos to make, certain URLs free, or, so that's really, really important, that point that she brought up, for sure.
Absolutely. No, I think it's so important for us to think about that kind of public collaboration with telecom companies, and how do we make it more equitable and accessible across the board, so that the onus isn't just on students and teachers to constantly find ways around the system. And coming back to your original question about like the ways in which the impact of our programs have kind of reached people and the kind of feedback that we've gotten. So again, a lot of what Trueman was saying as well, in terms of having that interaction with parents or being able to build, I think there's a lot of trust that needs to be built in a community to be able to have these resources be used, in a way that kind of gets over that skepticism or that hesitance. And I think that's really a cornerstone for our work as well, which is again why a lot of our work is specific to the context of Karnataka and specific to a lot of regions there, and it's based in Kannada. And ultimately, a lot of our work is about going to public schools, public colleges, also places for teacher educators and for teachers in training, and really building that trust with that community and having these workshops through the institutions themselves, where we build their digital capacity and build their digital literacy, train them in different programs and platforms that they can use to better their learning outcomes. And I think, as far as IT for Change's work goes, we are involved in a lot of work in the local and national context, but also on the global front, we do a lot of work on research and policy advocacy. But I think one of the greatest markers of our success in the education sector is that I think, month on month, our open educational resources and our education material on our website continues to be the most accessed. Despite all of the work that we do, it's still, that is the content that is most accessed, that has the most hits, that gets the most visitors month on month. And that's really, I think a marker of the way in which these educational resources are so important. It's just that a lot of students and teachers are just starved for them in ways that are contextually relevant. And I wanted to go back to the point of open educational resources. We've set up a platform called Karnataka Open Educational Resources, or the KOER, which is again a teacher-led kind of collaborative educational resource online, where basically there's, the idea of open educational resources, of course, is having educational resources that are either free of copyright or are under a Creative Commons license, where people can kind of adapt them to their own context, use them in different ways. And that's such an important part of just online learning, collaboration, just being able to not use the kind of cut, copy, paste solutions that are developed in different parts of the world, and just use them in contexts where they're completely irrelevant, but actually help to develop and co-create the resources that you use. And that's such a great platform also for teachers to connect to other teachers in the region, kind of do that kind of knowledge sharing about what's worked for them, what hasn't, build these resources together. And again, that platform is something that's just has, thousands of visitors every month, and is really used by a lot of the teachers in at least Karnataka, which is where a lot of our work is based. So I think it's all very encouraging, and they're all kind of extremely encouraging markers of our work in education, being able to reach out to the more marginalized constituencies that very often end up not being able to meaningfully access education. And another thing that I actually just wanted to very quickly talk about was we also have a community radio program for adolescent girls, which is actually, built by the adolescent girls themselves. So this happens weekly, and we're currently, I think, in our 30 something week. So, this has been going on for several months now. And it's in Kannada. It's a half an hour program that's in Kannada, but it's basically about building, of course, the digital capabilities of the girls themselves, but then also enabling them to do digital storytelling by themselves. So, have things like interviews, have things like vox pops, do things like audio plays, and enable them to do that audio recording, editing with, of course, the help and guidance of people from our team as well. And yeah, it's been so great to see the response from the adolescent girls to have this program that's particularly by and for them every week, that they can listen to, they can tune into, they can discuss amongst their peers, they can contribute to as well, because that's really about the whole idea about democratizing education. I mean, that's really what it comes down to, initiatives like this. So.
Yeah, super interesting when you brought up that aspect of using radio. I think when you have IT.
Yeah, I know that, sorry to jump in, but I know that Hannah talked about that a lot as well in her episode. And I was, just kind of nodding my head along and being like, yes, that's it. Radio is so important. IVR is so important. It's funny how these things are true across the globe.
Yeah, for sure. And, when having a lot of conversations about tech solutions, like digital technology solutions, in the global South context, there is always that aspect, that thing that comes up of using traditional media, just because, again, of various barriers to entry. And radio always is such an important one, isn't it? So I also want to ask you again, Tanvi. I want to sort of get into what's important about development solutions being local, coming from local players. IT4Change it's an Indian organization based in India, working on initiatives in India, so a local organization. What do you think makes a difference having a local organization versus an NGO externally, a foreign NGO coming in? Is there a difference, or what are some of the differences that you might see?
No, absolutely. I'm so glad you asked that question. And I think, it really gets into the heart of a lot of politics around development work, and especially in the global South, and kind of the differences and the challenges that crop up. So you're right. I mean, we are based out of India, and definitely a lot of our education, all of our education and field work is not just based in India, but specifically based in Karnataka, in the state of Karnataka. And I think, we say that, of course, there's difference between countries, but this is very often also true for countries of the global South, that there's difference within countries, and solutions and contextual realities of one particular part of the country it's not the same for other parts of the country. So when you really drill down to those contexts, they really differ. And I think one of the benefits of the fact that our work has been so focused on the local communities in Karnataka is that, of course, we are based out of Bangalore, but our education team, the entirety of them also come from Karnataka, or the vast majority of them. It's also about being able to speak the language, being able to speak the language of Kannada, and reach out to the teachers, do those workshops, reach out to the students as well. That really informs your work in a very different way, I think, as opposed to having the kind of international NGOs come in and sometimes maybe bring solutions that are more that are more appropriate for global North contexts, and then try to maybe localize them in a global South context, but maybe miss the mark, and don't really find a way to do that in a way that meaningfully actually contributes to on-ground realities. And I think it's really important to, it's why I'm so pleased to have Trueman on the panel today, because it's ultimately about solutions driven from the community. And I think a lot of our work as well, despite the fact that we are India-based NGO, despite the fact that we're a nonprofit based out of Karnataka, our work is also focused on kind of giving the agency back to the teachers and the agency back to the students. So it's not really about, I think, a lot of educational development programs or development programs in general run that risk of being very top down and very instructive in a way that takes agency away from the communities that they're actually engaging with. And that's ultimately not the aim. The aim is about kind of building capacities within communities so that they can consistently continue and build a self-sustaining kind of environment. And I think that's definitely been one of the differences, and that's definitely one of the benefits to having locally informed responses and locally informed context. I think this also a little bit comes back to that idea of why force is so important. Because when you have things like, IT companies, like these major IT companies are major players in the ICT and education space at the moment, more so since the pandemic. But what ends up happening is that when they have content that is, you have privatized content or like kind of content created by private entities that's then disseminated to different schools or institutes. I mean, of course, there's also the question of the money, but what ends up happening is that you become a consumer of that content or you become a user of that content. Very often you have to access it on a cloud. And that's, another part of how your institution is able to even access this kind of privatized content that's created by IT companies. It also privatizes the curriculum, because they're essentially deciding what gets taught and what doesn't. And it's becomes into this very centralized form of everyone is having access to the same resources that cannot change for context. And I mean, that is, of course, there are also other questions about the ways in which they use the data of the teachers and the students who are using them. That's a lot of the work that we do at IT for Change as well, in education and outside of it as well. But, this whole idea of the finder as the owner of the data. So they automatically own your data just because they're the ones that aggregated it. But I mean, there are all of these issues that crop up when we think about the private players in the education space. And the idea of force is about democratizing that space and saying that you have access to the source code of these softwares. You have the ability to kind of make that contextually relevant, to contribute to it in your own way. There's, of course, not that barrier of payment because it's free, it's not proprietary. It also means that sharing between teachers, for example, becomes much easier, because if we're all working on Audacity, I can share an audio file with another teacher much easier than having to pay for a proprietary software that not a lot of people may have access to. So, these are also, I think, this also comes back to that whole idea of locally informed, contextually relevant, because then you're saying that you're enabling the teacher and learner communities in different contexts to really create their own learning and material, co-create their own learning material, make it more contextually relevant. And also invite the students into that process as well. Again, it's not just a one-way communication, but also inviting students to play around with digital technologies, make digital stories, contribute to that entire environment. So yeah, I think there are a lot of politics of like development work and the way in which it's engaged in the global south. But I think in the context of education, this is why it's so important. Language, definitely, but also just contextual realities. Yeah.
Can I ask kind of to both of you actually, I mean, all of what you're saying is like so fantastic. And why do you think that these big international NGOs sort of fail? I mean, 87% of kids in Africa not being able to access internet is such a huge proportion, considering how much NGOs talk about the internet, and like, what do you think it is that's stopping them using solutions like Trueman's, or more radio, more mobile, and also what do you think is stopping them, if it is, from partnering with local organizations and thinking more about capacity building and all these things that we've been talking about? Is it like a lack of creativity? Is it ego? Is it, what do you think is actually stopping them?
That's actually a very brilliant question, and I think it also goes back to the question that Chipo asked about, the difference between local players doing these kind of things and on a larger scale NGOs. And I think it still goes back to the point that Tanvi was talking about, in terms of collaboration and the importance of it in these kinds of situations. And what I realized, I think I would speak from my own personal view and what I've been able to do with Dzidzo paDen, because with Dzidzo paDen, I actually partnered with UNESCO, and they're the ones who have been, funding everything from start to finish. And I think my key insights were that for most of these organizations, they have the financial muscle, they have the financial resources to fund any type of project that can help the societies. But ultimately, I'm a huge fan of this idea of design thinking when you're solving problems. And the first thing when you're design thinking, it's empathizing, right? Like being in the shoes of the people who are in the problem that you're trying to solve. And that's where, local players are better suited for the job, because there are people who are already in that kind of situation. So for me personally, I knew that in regards to education, these are some of the challenges that are there, because I've been there, I've experienced that. So it's kind of easy for me to think, hey, I've been in this challenge, how can I solve that? What are some of the solutions that I wish I had had when I was in that particular problem? So I think that's the biggest thing. NGO, I wouldn't really say NGOs are failing per se, but I think there's just that missing element of, do they actually have local players? Do they have people who are in those kinds of problems that are, thinking creatively or innovatively to say, hey, what's the solution that can help solve this? Because it's sort of like you're trying to work with, let me just give an example. Say there are some communities in Zimbabwe where clean water is a luxury and it's really a problem to find clean water. So an NGO might just come and say, hey, we're going to start buying you mineral water every day. We're going to give everyone a 5-liter bottle of water. But then if you know someone who's there who say, hey, no, the thing is, we had a bowl that was working, but it's no longer working, right? So it's better for you to either do another one or fix that one, because it makes water easily accessible, right? In that way, they collaborate and they find a more contextually relevant solution to that problem. So I think the key thing for NGOs and the like is they need to collaborate more with not only other organizations, but with people in general. Because when I thought about Dzidzo paDen, trust me, I knocked on multiple doors of organizations like USAID, I knocked on UNICEF doors, UNDP, World Vision, and I was just saying, hey, I have this idea, I think it could really help. And I think 99% of them didn't even reply to me. So I think there's just that misconception that individual players are just out there to get our money because we're NGOs. But it's really important for them to just keep an open mind and say, hey, let's invite local players, let's invite individuals who are in these particular instances to help us find more contextually relevant solutions.
What you're saying, Trueman, is, fantastic insights. And I also think, just from how you were describing your solution, I think there might also be a gap. Sometimes, firstly, you're very young, so maybe they might have been like, what does he know, for example? But you mentioned before that there are other solutions where the users need to go online, maybe use computers, etc., etc. So really quite much more complicated solutions, and even with local players, they may be looking out like to the global north or to other countries in the region that are more progressive in terms of internet access, etc., etc., rather than, and coming up with these sort of fancy solutions, rather than like looking in and saying, okay, what is actually going on the ground? What is being used on the ground? Can we just make something really simple? It's not simple, but like on WhatsApp, much more direct intervention, So I find that really interesting as well. So actually, like, we've had like so many good insights, and I just want to maybe start winding down, get some of your, final statements or final insights. So maybe Tanvi, you can, just your final statements on sort of a key point that you might want to raise, or something that you're looking forward to upcoming projects.
Thank you so much, Chipo. And yeah, thank you so much for having me on this panel. I've really had a great time. I just really wanted to echo Trueman's last few points about really just listening it's such an important part. I think it sounds simplistic to say it, but I think a lot of global North organizations don't listen, or they assume that they have complete knowledge of the context of certain regions or spaces, when that's not really the reality of what's happening on the ground. And kind of making space for voices from affected communities is really the way to go, to be honest, because that gives you the best and most appropriate solution, I think, for any context. So I really wanted to say that. And also, just in terms of this entire conversation that we've been having around education and digital education, or the use of ICTs in education, I think, it comes back to this. I think I've said it multiple times in the session so far, but I think it's really important to think about integrating ICTs into education as a long-term systemic process, where you need that kind of funding and backing from public organizations, from government bodies, to really enable that to happen, rather than it being something that can be this kind of techno-solutionist thing that happens overnight, especially given the pandemic. Currently in India, we see that there is really a crisis in education that's happening. And at least we at IT for Change, the way that we envision the best way forward is to open schools to some extent, with precautions in place, with teachers vaccinated, with that kind of distancing and hygiene protocols being accounted for. Because ultimately, like I said at the very beginning, schools are not just about education, but they're about the environment around it as well. They're about nutrition. They're about being able to interact with your peers. They're about having a relatively safer space where you're not pulled into, maybe labor through the day and things like that. And having this kind of year of no education, essentially, for a lot of students is going to impact, I think, for those who are younger as well, going to impact them in the future. And I think there is that kind of real push that needs to happen towards opening schools in a safe and systematic way, to have students come back and having the project of digital education ongoing in a way that's sustainable, rather than this happening overnight and you're essentially just making sure that maybe private school users are able to access digital education to the best of their ability, but a lot of public school users are not. And then that just kind of widens the digital divide in education, to be honest. So really, yeah, I think that's maybe something that we've been thinking a lot about, and hope that others will think a lot about as well, is, how can we really move towards enabling on-ground schooling to happen and have digital education as this continuous project that happens alongside in a sustainable manner. But yeah, thank you so much for having me here today. And I've really had a great time, especially listening to Trueman and listening to his insights. I think it's really been great to hear from a student currently, to really understand what's been going on in this kind of era of digital education. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tanvi. So Trueman, yeah, what are you looking forward to with your projects, or any other sort of things that you want to bring up as your last insight?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the question. And yeah, before I just jump into the question, I just want to say that it's been a really lovely conversation, and I've just been, thinking about a lot of things when I'm hearing, Tanvi talking about the work that they're doing with IT for Change. And I think some of the things I've actually realized that, we need to bring them on with Dzidzo paDen. But yeah, just to answer your question a bit more directly in regards to what I see with this project, and also just in terms of my last words on this platform. The first thing is what I always say with Dzidzo paDen, even when we launched in November last year. I said that Dzidzo paDen is a step in the right direction, but it's of course not the solution that's going to be all inclusive to everyone, because like I said, over 87% of kids do not have internet access, which means that even with this platform on WhatsApp, some kids are still not going to be able to access them. So beyond that, with Dzidzo paDen, what I'm looking at is diversifying and still going with that agenda of providing an inclusive approach to our education system. Because yeah, WhatsApp is easily accessible, but what about those kids who can't access WhatsApp at all? So I'm also looking into what are some of the innovative ways we can still distribute resources to those kids who are in even more marginalized communities. But for now, we're working on creating the content for the grade 1s up to upper 6s. Because I think one of the things that I did not mention was that in Zimbabwe, they introduced a new curriculum. So with the new curriculum, they started creating new content, new educational resources, new textbooks, and all of that. And because they are scarce and not like many and so many options, like in Cambridge, for example, it means those set of resources that are very expensive to find and to buy, actually. So that's why I've been saying that it's either you have hard copy resources or you do not have resources at all. So we're trying to also bridge that gap through creating our own content at Dzidzo paDen. That's also in the pipeline. We are working with the Ministry of Primary and Secondary Education to deal with that. And beyond education, this is also what I've been thinking about. I actually had a conversation with someone who's in the data science space. And what I've then also realized, and even up to now listening to Tanvi, like with the work that they're doing with IT for Change, teaching skills and all of that, I realized that there's also a gap in regards to the African child learning external skills that are not really covered by the education model. So beyond that, with Dzidzo paDen, we also want to tap into that space in order to distribute resources, for example, for financial literacy, or how to build or write your resume, because I've been blessed to learn those things at a very young age, because I took a gap year with the Leadership Academy here before I continued it with my A-levels. So I think it's really a huge space that if we tap into and actually help, we might be able to help quite a lot of kids just realize their fullest potential. But yeah, I think in my last words, I would say, beyond that, also, I just want to inspire other young people to find solutions, because this is just one of the problems. There are a lot of other problems that are there, and I just really want to see Zimbabwe and Africa, and even beyond that, the whole world, just young people innovating and solving solutions in their respective communities. But yeah, thank you so much for this platform. It's really been an amazing conversation.
Thank you so much, Trueman. I mean, honestly, I'm so inspired by you. I think you're doing a fantastic job, and I think it is really great to have young people. It's really, really important. You are like way more creative and responding to things, and digitally literate probably at this stage of your life. So I think it's really, really cool to do something like this. So really well done. So thank you, everyone. It's such a great conversation. I learned a lot, and there's a lot to think about, and yeah, we'll keep in touch and keep sharing these ideas. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chipo. It's been really great.
Thank you.